All right, well, I have 4 after, so we will go ahead and get started. We'll have some other folks joining us tonight, but I want to be conscious of everybody's time. Thank you all for joining us tonight for our June Student Series webinar. We are so excited to be having this conversation this evening on dual degrees in social work. We know that this is a common conversation that happens as we are going through our academic programs, but we don't have it so much at the large scale. So as we were thinking about programming that and conversations that would be helpful for folks thinking about careers in social work, this was absolutely a title and one of those that we wanted to have. We have a really great panel for you here tonight to talk about some various areas within social work and other professions and how they merge. We will talk tonight about career trajectories, hopefully have some time to get your questions answered about dual degrees, the pros, the cons, the good, the bad, the uglies, and how our panel's careers have been navigated because of these pathways that we've gone on. So we're so excited to see so many folks from all across the country here today. My name is Dwayne Brejak. I am the executive director for the Michigan chapter of NASW. I'm a macro licensed social worker. I do not have a dual degree, so I'll just throw that out there right away. But we have 3 fabulous panelists that I'm going to introduce you all to now, and I will let each one of them tell you a little bit more about themselves. But tonight we are joined by Kellan McNally, Sade Richardson, and Ayn Stehr. And I will let them all tell a little bit about themselves. So first, I'm going to kick it over to Kellan.
Cool. Hello, everybody. I actually feel like I saw someone say that they're calling in from Ghana. So instead of, I guess, saying good evening, I'll just say good day, wherever you are. And thanks for inviting me to become part of this conversation. And just so I can kind of put this thought out of my mind, can everyone hear me okay at this volume? Great. Yeah, so hi, my name is Kellan McNally, and I'm actually calling in right now from Detroit, Michigan. I'm going into my 3rd year of a PhD in social work and anthropology at Wayne State University in Detroit. And my combination of degrees is in social work. I have an MSW from Simmons College that I got in 2011. And then after that, I went on and completed a Master of Arts in medical anthropology from Boston University. I finished that up in 2019, which then led me to the dual degree program at Wayne State. So I'm not sure how much to say. I'm sure we'll probably get into a little bit more about sort of the backstory of how I found my way into medical anthropology after my MSW. But I think the overarching idea for me was I felt theoretically underprepared to practice as a social worker. I went to Simmons College, Simmons University, kind of goes back and forth between names, but I went to Simmons in Boston and got trained rather clinically, more or less to become either a psychotherapist or a psychiatric social worker, and really graduated with a lot of confusion that turning to medical anthropology has helped me kind of think through a little bit of the practice in social work. And I don't know if I would say come to terms with it, but I'm still wrestling, deeply with social work practice, even though I've gone on to get my clinical license and to work independently and across agencies. But anthropology really helped sort of sharpen my thinking, my critical thinking about the work that I was doing in a way that I think allowed me to actually engage in the practice of social work, and to sort of contextualize it historically, socially, culturally, in a way that I think my MSW preparation hadn't quite done for me. So that's sort of in a nutshell, sort of how I found my way to medical anthropology, and I'm looking forward to hearing questions and talking more about this tonight.
Thank you, Kellan.
Today, wherever we are.
Sade.
I am Sade Richardson. I'm actually calling in from St. Louis, Missouri right now. I'm here for the I am actually Director of Strategic Initiatives in the Office of Public Health Practice at University of Michigan School of Public Health. I am an alum of both the School of Public Health and the School of Social Work. I did both at the same time, so I can talk about the experience of sort of being dual enrolled and navigating that for those interested in public health and social work and how they overlap. And I'm also currently pursuing a doctorate in social work at the University of Louisville. And I'm not sure if there's anything else I should add there, but I think that's enough to get us started.
Thank you. Anne, what about you?
Yes, good evening. Hi, everybody. I'm Ayn Stehr. I'm in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. It's about 97 degrees outside for those of you who love warm weather. I received my master's in social work in 1982. Yes, I'm the elder in this group today, and received my law degree from Southern University Law Center, again, here in Baton Rouge, Louisiana in 1992. I am currently the former executive director of the Louisiana chapter of NASW, and currently I am still, after 30-something years, the legal consultant for Louisiana's Supreme Court's Louisiana Protective Order Registry. So I'm glad that y'all all joined us tonight, and I can't wait to hear about your experiences. I see some of you are already working on dual careers, so it'll be a fun dialogue.
Thanks, Anne. Yeah, what an interesting group of pathways we have here tonight with us. So, diving into those a little bit, let's talk about your journeys and how you got to the place you are now, whether that's a current student or in a position at the Supreme Court level at your state. Kellan, you mentioned a little bit about your journey, but would you like to expand on how you got to the place you're at right now?
Sure. One of my first jobs out of my MSW was working as a crisis clinician outside of Boston, Massachusetts, doing emergency services for a 24-hour service. And that was really exciting work. I ended up doing that kind of work for about 8 years. And it introduced me to lots of people. I had probably 4 or 5 encounters every day, and the next day would be 4 or 5 new people, and maybe 6 months later it would be some of these people would come back into contact with our service. So just a lot of exposure really early on. And I think that really started to stir up some questions in me about sort of what is this system that I was working in, and to kind of think at this more structural infrastructure level of like, what are these clinical social work services that I was suddenly a part of and expanding, and I didn't know what to do with it. So I really think that sort of set me on this path of asking more questions and trying to get a little deeper into the history of sort of when did this shift sort of happen in social work, or how did things gradually become more and more clinical, at least in the state where I was working, which led me to medical anthropology. I can kind of, as the conversation goes on, maybe I'll talk in more specifics, but I went on to supervise a number of new social workers and early graduates, and have really just tried to support students to sort of sit with their confusion and to respect it, and to really question some of the assumptions and beliefs that go into a lot of the work that we do as clinicians. And I found medical anthropology was a great space to really hold a lot of that confusion with me.
Now, when you were looking at getting an advanced degree, there's not a lot of programs that have dual social work and anthropology. Were there other options that you were thinking about, and what ended up being the deciding factor to go down this route?
Yeah, I thought about public health actually, because I think there are a lot of comparisons and related points between public health and medical anthropology. In the end, I decided to go. Well, I mean, I found medical anthropology in the Boston University School of Medicine. And what attracted me to that program in particular was not that it really was interested in turning me into an anthropologist. It's that it wanted to improve me as a clinician. And so, although I am in a dual program now that, ultimately I could claim to be an anthropologist, I still very much feel like I'm working on becoming a better and better social worker. And so for me, a dual degree has been more, what can I bring into my social work practice that enhances it through this interdisciplinary study? And I found that, and I think there are more programs like this, like Boston University's program, where med schools in particular bring in medical anthropologists to try to support clinicians working across the spectrum of healthcare, whether it's, increasingly social workers, but certainly physicians, nurses, anyone kind of working in the sort of healthcare space. Like, how do we think about cross-cultural work that we're doing really critically? How do we think about the environment in sort of its broadest sense, environment as both history and economy? And medical anthropology it existed already. I didn't have to sort of force it into social work. It was sort of already there as a way to enhance clinical practice.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I mean, I think those intersections are often what lead people into wanting these dual focus areas. And you mentioned health specifically. So Sade, I think that that's a great transition to talk about like why public health. And I think that that's probably maybe one of the more common ones we see with a social work degree and MPH. What made you go down that route?
Yeah, so my bachelor's is in public health and digital media studies. So I'd had that public health sort of exposure beforehand. What really made me consider social work was I participated in the Future Public Health Leaders Program at University of Michigan when I was an undergrad. And my mentor was a dual MPH MSW. And that's where I even learned like dual degrees were a thing that people did or could consider that could potentially be a pathway or an option for me. And at the time, it's like, oh, social work, like my best friend growing up in like high school, her mom was a social worker, her sister, but I really only saw like they worked within the courts. So I really only saw that aspect of social work, that sort of direct client relationship part of it. And it was looking into my own understanding of like what social work was, what the pathways were. Looking at U of M, I had already known I was like admitted into the MPH program and I was going to come here. And it kept in the back of my mind, like, oh, maybe I should consider doing the dual program. Like, I know these people are doing it. It was really a stranger that I spoke to who happened to be a grad of Michigan School of Social Work while I was interning at the Alliance for Coney Island in Brooklyn, New York. She said her going back and forth, you should just do it. And I took that to heart. I was like, okay, this is my sign. I'm a big believer in signs and things working as it should. And I applied, I moved to Michigan and I found out I got in when I got here. And for me, what really cemented sort of the interest was that social work was just not looking at like clinical practice or approaches, right? There's this whole area of macro practice and thinking of like evaluation and policy and all the different areas that people can work in with social work. So people always ask me all the time, like, which do you like better? Or like, what's the difference? And to me, public health and social work are so intertwined that I don't exactly see it as me doing different things. I think it provides different lenses to view the work that I'm doing. So for instance, I always joke like public health gives me the language to move within this health space. And social work gives me the tools to be able to do the work that I'm doing, because everything that you do has to do with people. And if you can't communicate with people, you're not going to get stuff done. So in my role, I sit on a bunch of different community coalitions and boards, and I'm trying to move things forward, helping students kind of think through their own pathways and trajectories and how they show up in community. And it's really using those skills that I learned within the social work classroom more so than the skills that I learned at the School of Public Health to be able to push that forward. So that's kind of my trajectory about how I ended up where I was. And I mean, I did go straight through. So I went undergrad straight into grad. Don't know if I'd recommend that, but I personally knew if I got a paycheck and I did not go into school at that time, I probably would not have gone back. It's really hard when you're getting a paycheck to like give it up. Hence, I'm doing a doctorate in social work versus a PhD. It's a space and I could still work while I go to school.
Thank you for that story. I actually went into social work because one of my friends was getting her MPH and said, "You're an MSW, go get your MSW." And what about you? What brought you from MSW to JD?
Well, I guess I want to start a little earlier. You know, I was a late bloomer. I didn't start college, undergraduate until I was 25. I had, I was a single parent by then with 2 children. And so as a student, I did work, but I volunteered with the newly created suicide hotline on campus. And so that really, exposed me to students who were struggling, really struggling. So it encouraged me to, gain my inner strength and reach beyond myself and my own needs and help others. And then at the same time, there was a movement in the city to look into establishing a battered women's program. So I volunteered with that too. And so as I was completing my undergraduate degree, my best friend was going into grad school, a PhD program in psychology. And I just couldn't give 4 more years plus an internship and all that. So I looked into the MSW program and I thought, 2 years, I'll get a master's degree. I can work with people directly. I can do, administrative work. It seems like a better fit for me. And so I was accepted into the graduate program and ended up with a master's in social work, and was fortunate enough to be hired as the executive director of the newly established Battered Women's Program in Baton Rouge. So that began a true, I guess, growth period for me emotionally, just in my awareness of challenges for all sorts of people, at all stages of life. And during that, in that role, I had the fortune, as I was trying to expand services, to establish a relationship with a young prosecutor who wanted to know more about domestic violence so that she could prosecute those crimes. Well, she, was a great influence on me. She ended up being elected judge and moving on to the Supreme Court. And I'll finish that story in a minute. But as the director of a domestic violence program in the mid to late 80s, laws in Louisiana were archaic. And so in an effort to get victims of domestic violence and their children what they were needing and safety and support, it was necessary to change the laws. So that began my introduction to the legislative process. So we were successful and were able, to change laws. And so that was a very good experience, but it got me to the point where I understood that I felt that I needed to know more about laws, and certainly the process and in changing them, both at the state level as well as the federal level. So my friend that I met as a prosecutor and now a judge got elected to the state Supreme Court. She encouraged me to go to law school. And so I thought, well, it's only 3 years. so, can I pass that LSAT? Well, just so happened the LSAT was scheduled for the next week. So anyway, so I walked on, obviously made a score high enough to be accepted into a law school in Louisiana. Loved every moment of it, loved learning the law, and how its application can really change circumstances for people. It really can be used for good, not just to punish people. So I have never regretted both my experience as a social worker and my experience as a lawyer, and they've worked very well for me in everything I've tried to do insofar as reform for women and children, juvenile justice reform, criminal justice reform, healthcare, choice, everything. Those two educational experiences and practice experiences, it's really given me the tools that I've needed to help, in groups trying to make a difference.
Fabulous. Well, and that really does transition into, having these parallel paths or skill sets that are combined. Have any of you noticed a difference in how you have thought about your career trajectory, or even opportunities that may have expanded as it relates to coalitions or other sort of outside work that you've been involved with? And this could go to anybody.
I think for me, I've found it really to be seen as sort of an asset in the spaces that I move or operate in. So for instance, if we're talking about a specific problem, and a lot of times it may be people that are just in public health or within that space, I can like pull in the social work aspects or be like, well, let's think about this problem in this way, or like, have we considered this? So for instance, today with one of our sessions, a practice session, we're talking about professionalism for students and how we would teach or approach that. And I was like, well, in social work, we have this standard with our code of ethics that we approach around. So I've always been able to pull from that perspective of like, okay, these are some things that we can model and bring into the spaces. It's definitely been an asset in my like job searches in terms of like something that sort of set me apart. It's always a point of conversation with any job that I've interviewed for. People are like, oh, well, why social work? Why social work? Why public health? Like, how do you see it overlapping, or how does it apply? So being able to speak to sort of the transferable skills, and for me, educate people on social work and what it is beyond just like what people might think about it, and be like, social work, you can apply to anything. Honestly, every aspect of life needs to have a social worker. I firmly believe. I think the world would be a better place if we had more social workers in policy or like in higher decision-making powers, but definitely opening doors, it's been an asset. And just being able to approach any problems or think about it in sort of a systematic way, and bring it back down to like thinking about people. Because I think we can get into this sort of structural talk and like to think big picture and higher level, but we forget about thinking of people as individuals and their impacts and their life stories and what they bring to the table as well, and like pulling community into spaces.
Well, in the work that I do with the Supreme Court involves a lot of training and education. And the goals of the project that I work with the Supreme Court is safety, is safety and support for victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, and stalking, as well as the dual role of accountability of perpetrators. So in one way, it's hard for me to distinguish whether it was, my training and experience as a social worker or my training and experience as a lawyer, which one contributes. I think, the way I train and interact with people comes from my social work experience, and social workers that I'm exposed to. And I think the information comes from, my law experience as a lawyer. But then again, my way of explaining complex laws to people who need to know in their roles what they can do with that knowledge on behalf of victims goes back to, I think, my social work experience, how to look at complex circumstances, whether whether they're laws or practices or entities, and kind of pull out, as Sade was saying, how to, bring it down to something simple that you can then develop a plan so that you can succeed.
I'll add a little bit too. I think my dual focus in anthropology is also something that I have to kind of monitor and be careful about how I present it, because it's not automatically something that people have a lot of exposure and familiarity with. So, sometimes people, I think, will confuse archaeology with anthropology, and they'll ask me sort of, well, what do ruins and bones have to do with social work? And so there's some careful, just sort of familiarizing and educating people about what anthropology is. And I think that it can also narrow some of my career opportunities too, because many people will just sort of be like, I don't get it. And that is something that I have to kind of watch out for professionally, and sort of make sure I stay a few steps ahead of it, particularly as I work through this doctoral program, and will eventually be on the job market as a researcher. And want to make sure that any university that might hire me sort of understands that anthropology contributes to my scholarship and improves me. I would argue improves me as a qualitative researcher and critical thinker. So yeah, I think all of our dual degrees, they can add and enhance our social work, but they can also be misunderstood and might limit us in some ways too.
Yeah, I mean, I hear that thread between the three of you. Social work already has sometimes a hard time with the public knowing exactly what we do in what spaces. And so then when you add some extra letters, then it can cause that double layer of confusion. And I would imagine in some of the settings that you all have been in, that you have to explain a little bit more about why the MSW, why is that piece in there? Sade, you mentioned that, and you also mentioned that too. Why would a social work degree be helpful in a legal setting? Why would social work be helpful in a public health setting? And I don't know if either of you or Kellan, if any of you have any examples of times where you've had to really explain the benefit of your MSW in maybe that other world.
Yeah.
I can think about, so I work a lot with students, graduate, undergraduate, across the spectrum. A big part of where I had to use my social work skills in the last year was sort of advocating. We used to have an embedded counselor in the school. With COVID, she left. We're now should have one back for the fall. So it's been at least a little bit over a year that we have not had one. And so where I can bring the social work lens is thinking of okay, about complex trauma and the way students are showing up in the spaces, and how the importance of making sure that professors, staff, anybody who's interacting with students are sort of prepared to have these conversations or recognize certain signs and be able to triage or direct students to getting the care or the conversations, whether that's with a social worker or the therapist, whatever sort of spaces that they need to have that support. So I've been doing a lot of unofficial case management and sort of advocacy around that, even though that's not the space that I tend to operate in, right? But I've gotten those skills from my social work degree to recognize and say, hey, this is something that we should be thinking about in our curriculum. This is stuff we should do more programming around this, because I've noticed or seen these things that are happening, and things are going to get more challenging in that way. That's a really tangible example that I can think of. Just talking about things. I feel as social workers, we're able to recognize or see things from a different perspective or point of view than a lot of people sometimes. And that can be an asset in most cases. But it's really just providing that voice or that space to be hey, let's think about this in a different way.
Well, there's a couple of questions in the chat that have come forward that specifically talk a little bit about macro practice and policy space. So I maybe want to move into that before we open up a larger question. So Rachel had just a good question about can you talk a little bit more about macro practice? And I think that is not an emerging area of social work, but it's an area that you don't see as focused on in a lot of academic programs. And as a macro licensed social worker, Michigan's one of the few states that currently have a macro license. You know, it really encompasses anything from a systems perspective or a systems view. So that can be policy work, research, program development, community organization, policy analysis, administration and leadership, kind of management tracks. And I think you've seen there are some schools of social work that have strong macro components that you can really get some of the things that may be more appealing in a dual degree. I think some of the stuff Anne you're talking about with legislative works, there's a couple of social work programs that have pretty strong political social work tracks. And so if you're going down that particular route, that may be an option for folks as opposed to maybe getting a JD or some other related degree, but they are few kind of and far between at this particular time. And so I also see that, Kellan, with your anthropology background, like that is a very unique approach. And so maybe social work hasn't done enough to incorporate some of those ideas or thoughts into our own practice, or maybe it does need to be completely separate. But Jason also kind of asks on the policy side, what sort of routes would you all suggest for folks who are interested in working in the policy space? Can you find that within social work, or would it be helpful to look in a dual option?
Dwayne, after the panelists speak, do you mind if I speak to that?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, thank you.
So again, thinking about what are some routes that social works, potential social work students could take if they wanted to go into more of a policy focused concentration. Any thoughts behind that from the group?
So I know some things that automatically come to mind to me is if your school of social work allows you to take classes in other departments. So for instance, at Michigan, I took classes in the School of Business, like the School of Information. Some people took classes at the School of Public Policy. Take advantage of those opportunities, as well as find ways to get engaged in policy. So you all can all sit on your local boards, right? So looking at your county and seeing, okay, are there openings within the board for me to get involved at local government, to have an idea, or say, like most of them, you just apply. There's an application that you do, and then you're involved with that. Getting involved with NASW. This is a great way for you to like get involved with different policies, or thinking of like what's happening within legislation, how it's affecting the profession. Finding your local like council people, or getting like internships in those offices or spaces are also another great avenue to learn and like see what you're interested in, how you want to tap into policy or advocacy. There are lots of groups that are working on things from the grassroots level to higher up federal policy. So looking at what's happening in your area, there are organizations on campus, like U of M has like I forgot what it's called, but it's like a clinic that they help and give like legal supports or work on policy issues with. So there are lots of different ways or avenues that you can look into it if you can't necessarily say, okay, an MSW is kind of expensive and I can't really add on this JD or add on this extra thing, but you can get creative in the way that you tap in. And again, remember, social work skills are transferable. So tapping in and writing that, how you write up your resume to get into those spaces is also helpful as well.
I'll chime in here too. For me, I would say it was helpful to remember that policy happens at all levels, and it also happens at the organizational level for those of us working in interpersonal practice or clinical practice. So if you find yourself in a work environment where you're frustrated or you're confused and you would like to see things differently, express your ideas about how you would like change to happen. That is a policy proposal. And as you advance in your career and take on more leadership role, your ability to implement those ideas is policy in action. And so I think to kind of to understand and think that you can do policy work at all sorts of levels, not only sort of the macro at the sort of macro and community level, but it also happens in our organizations too.
I think that's a good point. And, you know, I mean, while you're still in grad school, I mean, the internships that you have to choose from, I know in many, many states, if not all states, one of the internships that folks can do is with the NASW chapter. And you get to work on a lot of policy issues if you're the intern, or, you know, in the group of interns that that chapter has for that year. And a lot of state and federal agencies also, and local city, you know, city and county parishes in Louisiana have positions for grad students too, you know, in there at the policy level. So I think you can get a lot of experience while you're still in grad school if policy is where you want to go. Spend your internship time, you know, doing just that. And, you know, you might have an entree or two into a job post-grad.
Yeah, I totally agree with all of that. And as for the BSWs who are on the line, are on the meeting today, you know, I would say explore. You know, social work is such a vast field. You can do anything and work in any setting, and we need social workers everywhere. I mean, what I love about working at NASW is get to hear about all of the cool places that social workers are that you never thought there would be a social worker, and the inventive things that people are doing constantly. And to go to Kellan's point, we need policy advocates at every level. You know, when we think about social work pay and workforce issues, we need advocacy within organizations. We need folks who are working on things at the local and state level, as we see kind of this slew of really regressive policies happening across our country, from the school board levels to the state legislatures and at the federal level. And then we need folks at the tables. So we need people to run for positions too. So there's a whole range of where, as social workers, we can fall into this spectrum. And it's just really, what's your passion? You know, I went into social work because I loved politics, and I had a psychology undergrad degree. And it's like, what can kind of merge those two? Oh, look, this code of ethics has this whole section 6 that says we have to be politically engaged as a profession, regardless if we're doing direct practice work. And so I think policy can be so fun. It's definitely frustrating, but there's a lot of ways to see immediate impact for folks at every level. And our field is in somewhat of a transformative moment where we have these huge licensing discussions going on nationally. There's a social work compact moving. We have these social justice issues that are in front of us, and we're in a workforce shortage, right? This is the time to be going into the field of social work because everyone needs you. But how do we make sure that when you're going into those positions, they're set up so you're not going to burn out, that the salary is not just a living wage, but a thriving wage, right? That there's advancement for mobility. And that also often comes from policy decisions at those internal organizational levels. And so I appreciate that question. Brittany, did you have other things you wanted to add in as we think about policy stuff?
I'm so excited. Listen, I'm not a panelist, so please forgive me, but I'm going to give a 3-sentence background. So I'm currently a limited licensed social worker in macro practice. So I have my LMSW-Macro in the state of Michigan. I'm also a dual, so I graduated with my MSW from U of M. I'm currently working on my master's of public policy, same school at U of M. I have worked in the federal government, I've worked in the state government, and now I currently work for the Michigan Supreme Court. So Ayn, that's awesome that you work for your state Supreme Court. I love meeting other state Supreme Court employees. That's awesome. And I will say just a couple things to add on to this dialogue is a lot of MSW students that go into the policy track of their MSW program, I've gotten a lot of questions like, well, how different or similar is it to a master's of public policy? And I'm going to be quite honest, it's quite different. It's very, very different. So the master's of social work with a policy political concentration focuses on like advocacy, grassroots organizing, etc. Whereas the master's of public policy focuses on like your quantitative skills, like program evaluation, statistical methods, research. And so data analytics of policies that come into play. So I will say the MPP is a lot different than the MSW like policy track in just different ways. Another shameless plug that I wanted to give is I just put it in the chat, the Congressional Research Institute for Social Work and Public Policy. They're an organization in DC that I follow because of being my MSW MPP self. And so they're a great grassroots organization to get social workers into Congress. And that meant a lot to me as someone that's interned on the Hill. I also wrote a bill that was introduced into federal Congress called the Protecting Sibling Relationships in Foster Care Act. And I had the chance to write it as an intern, and then it got introduced. I'm like, whoa, my own bill got introduced in federal Congress. Oh my God. Like, so, you know, because of my own lived expertise and experience in foster care. So I am a huge advocate for young people in foster care. And, you know, I do that on the policy level, the macro level, the public, on the Michigan Supreme Court level. I do it on more like a judicial level. And so with that being said, I just wanted to put the plug in for the Congressional Research Institute for Social Work and Public Policy. I wanted to also state that the MPP is totally different than the social work political track. And then Sade, I wanted to ask you, I saw that you're doing a workshop on radical self-care and social work. Could you talk a little bit about that? Sorry, I know that was a mouthful, but I just wanted to I love this conversation. Right when I saw the dual degrees, I registered because I'm very passionate about getting social workers to be dual degrees.
Yeah, so the workshop you're talking about, so U of M, we have like an alumni conference called like Building Healthy, Strong Communities. So I'm doing a workshop around self-care and social workers, not just your typical like, oh, we need to like have bubble baths and relax, which is important and a big part of it, but really kind of blowing up the idea of like work-life balance, because I don't like work-life balance. I like to think of work-life harmony. Balance is unachievable and unattainable for a lot of us. So thinking of ways of how you can better integrate things so that it works better for you. And then I'm going to talk about some different models or approaches to self-care and give some tips around that. I won't get too much into that to derail us, but yeah, I'm doing that. I think that's this coming week, next Thursday. Yeah.
Well, and that's, I mean, this is a great conversation, and I wish we had time to like for everybody on this call to talk a little bit more, because Brittany, just you as a student had a bill introduced, right? Like that's big stuff, right? And we know that all of you on this call chose social work for a reason, or maybe it chose you, right? But you're here because you want to change a system. You saw an inequity somewhere. You got helped by a social worker, and maybe had barriers in your own life at some point. And really thinking about dual degrees, I think, can be, how do you expand your reach and your work? And we know that that's not attainable for everyone. So I want to transition us a little bit into like the reality of like what a dual degree means, right? That it's more money, it's time, it's all those barriers that already exist when you're likely already getting one degree. So can we talk about a little bit, how might you all recommend we enrich social work, the already existing social work structure, for folks who couldn't afford or don't have the capacity for a dual degree? What are some things that we can think about doing to incorporate some of this work already?
I definitely want to recognize that. I have a ton of student loans and I'm okay with that. I have reconciled it for myself where it's either going to be forgiven through this public student loan forgiveness program, or it's going to die with me, and I'm okay with that. For a lot of people, they are not comfortable with that, and that is okay too. I think it's also kind of deciding or finding, there's lots of ways to learn things, right? Beyond just the traditional like academic sense. So it's like finding workshops or things that are happening in your community, going to things like this and hearing different things, reading things. I think we're in an age where information is at our fingertips, and it's sort of for us to kind of tap in and figure out now, whether it's misinformation, that's a whole other topic, but you can learn things from YouTube. You can learn things from all these online open source MOOCs that are happening across universities. You can go to things that are happening that are public, that are happening across campuses. You can sit in on classes, right? And sort of pick up on these things, audit things, and find ways to do learning outside of like the traditional degree sense of that experience. Now, if you're in a degree program, I still also feel like you have to make the most out of it beyond just going to your classes. So sign up and get engaged with organizations, Go to talks, go to lectures, hear what people are saying, sign up to be someone that's facilitating a workshop around something, because that's another way for you to learn as you prepare for that, and also share the information and knowledge and skills that you have.
I can just say how I have obtained 2 degrees was after my MSW, my graduate degree in anthropology was something I chipped away at. I paid for a class at a time. I fought with my organization for tuition reimbursement. They often told me, we won't pay for these courses because it doesn't produce, we don't hire anthropologists, so we won't pay for anthropology courses. I knew it was valuable, so I just sort of chipped away at it and saved up money. So that was hard, and it was just something that I believed was important for me, so I kind of kept at it. And then at the PhD level, I was specific about only applying to a school that would offer me fellowship, so that I wouldn't go into debt to get trained at the doctoral level.
Yeah, I think that's great advice about, you may have to poke around a lot more to figure out, especially if you are looking for a way to get school covered, where might be the best fit to do that. And there was a question kind of directed at you that's around this too. We have a attendee who's considering an MSW JD program, and their question is, with the ability to self-educate with modern technology, do you still believe it's worth it to spend the 3 years and money in law school to understand the legal system?
Well, I think any educational effort is worth the effort if it's you want to do. And I know that that's a simplistic answer, and certainly my experience is very dated. You know, I worked, you know, year round, and I got as many loans as I could get, you know, and struggled to pay them back, but did that. I certainly hope that our federal legislation will pass so that, you know, student loans can be forgiven. I think, you know, the price of advanced degrees and advanced degrees are much too costly. You know, the average undergraduate, you know, is looking at, well, I don't know, maybe $100,000 or, you know, or more, you know, for a professional degree. So I think our entire country has to address that. And I know that there are bills being filed to allow folks to have a free, you know, 4 years of college and all that. So anyway, we've got to work on that as a country. It really is a shame that a country as rich as ours has some of the challenges and problems that we have for most of our population. But at any rate, you know, if you're interested in the law, I don't think you necessarily have to go to law school to understand it. If you're working on policy issues or doing legislative reform, if you don't have a law degree, it's okay. If you can read, then, you know, and if you're in grad school or have an undergraduate degree or a student at all, you can understand. If you can read the language, you know, you can understand. Now, you know, you may not understand the nuances and how it connects to other laws. And my decision to go to law school was because I was continually told that you just can't do that in the law, you know, and of course you can, because we did, you know, but what that education gave me was a breadth of knowledge about all kinds of laws and, you know, how they're developed, how they interact with each other. And so anyway, to me, it was well worth the 3 years and my children eating bologna sandwiches, you know, 5 days a week. So even they acknowledged that it was worth it because, you know, once I was out, things were better for all of us. So, you know, you have to decide for yourself. If the 3 years is worth it for you, you will get a tremendous amount of information that will help you decide what kind of law you want to practice, at what level you want to practice. You know, my oldest grandson is getting ready to go to Georgetown in August, and he knows exactly what he wants to do. He wants to do public criminal defense. You know, he doesn't want to be wealthy. He believes and understands, and, you know, has been exposed to some of the cases I've had, a death penalty case that he was very interested in. So anyway, you know, you got to figure out, is that 3 years and the cost worth it to you? You know, what do you want to do with that knowledge?
Thank you. And I think as it relates to kind of systems change, even within social work, one of the things really happening right now, when I talked about we're in kind of this transitional period, is there's a lot of really amazing advocacy being done to try to eliminate some of those barriers within social work and social work education. So there are many states that are working on paid student internship bills. You know, Michigan had one passed last year, and we've got a couple in the legislature, and a couple of other states have things. There's lots of licensing advocacy happening right now, specifically around the social work examination and the licensure compact nationally. You know, there are bills around trying to increase compensation, reimbursement rates, and the more collective we can all be from our experiences individually. You know, probably most of us on this call have some form of student debt or had some form of student debt, and I'm with Sade. It's either going to get forgiven or it's going to die with me. It feels like it's going to die with me at this point, but hopefully not, right? But we need to try to eliminate as many of those barriers for the next generation of social workers too. And so there's some really important work being done on your campuses. There's student organizing that's happening around that, and across disciplines as well. You know, this makes me think about we had a comment in the chat from Juana, as someone from not in the United States, as in a developing country. International organizations are actively introducing programs to help vulnerable groups, WHO, WHO, PAHO, UNDP, the EU. And they wonder, what sort of degrees would you recommend for consultancy jobs with those organizations? And maybe before we go into the larger discussion, or while y'all are thinking about that, you know, NASW pretty regularly meets with other countries who are thinking about social work or are exploring social work, because social work looks very different all across the globe, right? An MSW degree in the United States is very different from in England versus Australia versus in some parts of the world where they don't have formalized social work. And so in Michigan, we actually a few years back had a group from Uganda come and meet with us to talk about forming social work in their own country. And it's very, I mean, we would love to see more social work across the globe. And there are some really good coalition groups that folks can belong to if you are interested in global work, or if you're somebody who is international listening in today. There's the International Federation of Social Work. NASW has an international chapter that has folks all across the globe. So I think that first step is just getting connected to people who might already exist in your region, and then thinking about what are those other needs that you have in your specific country and what degrees might be related to that. Because I could absolutely see, you know, where a JD and having folks on the legal sense is going to make important, because you may have a lot of policy work to do at that initial level. But public health, that's going to be huge in a lot of places. Anthropology is going to be huge. So I'm just curious if other folks on our panel have thoughts about, if you were going to do international work, how your degree might fit in there, or if you see any other fields that might be helpful to think about.
So this gets me really excited because I'm originally from Trinidad, which is an island in the Caribbean. So international work, love it. I think it's really important. I do a little bit of it with my current job, where we take students to Grenada to work on projects. You can absolutely do this stuff with an MSW. I did part of my thing of lifelong learning through the Network for Social Work Management. I signed up for a mentor who happens to be an international social worker. And she just has her MSW, but has worked in like Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Kenya, all these different places with her MSW. And her advice with it is sort of showing your transferable skills and being confident in the value that your social work degree brings to these spaces. for people that are interested in this kind of work, if you send me an email, there's a database that she compiled that's shared with us for how you find jobs in these areas. So I'd be happy to share that with anyone if that's helpful.
Well, and I see another kind of comment in the chat too around having somebody with a bachelor's in business thinking about an MSW degree. So we may have some non-social workers contemplating a social work degree, and there's absolutely space in social work and need in social work for folks with business mindset, from entrepreneurship. There's a lot of business and whether it's marketing, advertisement, budgeting, staffing, management, that is tied in what we do. And it's ingrained a little bit into, I think, an MSW curriculum, but probably not as much as a lot of us would like to see. So yeah, we would love to have you if you're thinking about an MSW. And then there are, as we think about other combinations that exist for dual degree, MSW MBAs, that's another pretty popular one that is out there as well. Public policy. So we've got public health and public policy, that's one we also see pretty regularly. Now for the three of you, have there been any negatives by having a dual route that you have noticed? Maybe besides the student debt one.
I can't think of any negatives that I've experienced, other than my children living almost in poverty for an extended period of time. But no, I can't think of any negatives. I am very thankful of my education and experience in social work. I think when we first talked, I indicated that being a social worker made me a much better lawyer. I cannot imagine practicing law without having had my social work education and experience. It just has made me, I think, a better person and a better lawyer.
Well, I guess I think it's possible to know too much. And this is maybe a criticism of social work, is that our practices tend to rely on a lot of assumptions about the individuals we're serving. And I think any kind of interdisciplinary study introduces alternative frameworks and paradigms that can complicate social work practice. And that doesn't necessarily make the work easier. It can make the work, as it was for me, I think, richer and more interesting. It can give me sort of codes to switch in and out of, even sort of with my coworkers and with the people I was supporting. But I think social work practice, a fault of it is that it can rely, and is increasingly coming to rely on kind of manualized practices that, as I said, rest on a number of assumptions about individuals and sort of the origins and the causes of their suffering. And bringing in alternative frameworks can make that more complicated rather than more straightforward. I don't think that that's necessarily a problem, but it's kind of a warning about sort of stepping outside of this sort of social work framework, at least where it is right now, with some of our allegiance to the medical model, I would say.
Yeah, that's a great thought, Kellan. And I think about how, where a dual degree probably could be really helpful in some settings by giving social workers a different perspective, because often we do work in interdisciplinary settings, and how sometimes the other folks don't get us. and being able to frame things in different ways may be able to pull the field into a stronger sense. So before we take some other questions from the audience, I'm just curious from what advice would you all give to somebody considering a dual degree? What were some of the considerations you all thought about, and you would want to make sure somebody who is thinking about this has got on their mind?
I think the biggest thing is to think about what makes sense for you. Everybody's not going to agree with it or support it in the way that you might want to, or understand why you're doing it. So you need to decide for yourself why you're doing it, why it matters to you, what value you think it's going to bring, and consider all the different options or possibilities. Especially like if finances is a big thing, consider maybe, okay, perhaps doing an online program for one, for instance, right? Or seeing if there's some sort of pipeline opportunity that you can do to help kind of mitigate that cost so it's a little bit faster. Those are things to consider. Maybe even if you need to work for a few years and see if your job offers some sort of tuition assistance that they can help with that to help offset that. But I think the biggest thing for me was doing it for me, not necessarily for my family or anybody else to understand like why I'm doing it and how it overlaps, especially if you're going to do public health and social work. A lot of people are like, well, public health, like, are they really that different? And I'm like, yeah, they're different. They're similar, but they're still very different. And they bring different things to the table.
I agree. You know, it has to be something that you're really wanting to do. You know, it has to fit for you. It may not fit for your friends or your relatives, but if it fits for you, um, that's what matters, you know, because you'll use it. You absolutely will. I think I was, well, I don't think, I know I was a little short-sighted when I made the decision to go to law school. I was focusing on, you know, legislative reform in a very narrow aspect when it comes to when you learn, you know, that there are laws at all different levels of government and all around the world. And that education in law school opened my eyes. And I realized that there was so much more that I could do to help people. So, you know, I quadrupled my reasons for going to law school once I was there.
For me, deciding what is the credential that I'm after, and how is that going to impact my life, and what is the learning that I'm after, and how is that going to improve my social work and my ability to sustain myself in social work too. And so I think chasing the credential is important because our jobs are often undervalued and underpaid, and a dual degree can seem like a strategy for advancement, like financially, sort of being mobile financially in this field. And that's important to be honest about. But I think that can't be a sort of the reason alone for embracing a dual degree. Like, I think for me, it really had to also be about the learning and like, what does this other field offer me as a practitioner and as a social worker? And so trying to differentiate those two is still something I wrestle with, but I'm trying to appreciate the learning and not let the credential be the only thing that I'm after.
Yeah, no, that's a really good observation, Kellan. And Lacey put into the chat a question that kind of touches on that and what Sade mentioned a minute ago. So are there other things that you all have had to sacrifice because of the time or financial requirements that you feel you missed out on? Could be travel, hobby, lifestyle, finding a partner, starting a family, all the above. How did you decide to find balance, if at all, and in maintaining an enjoyable life? Yeah, hopefully you can have an enjoyable life with a dual degree at the same time, but it is intense to add in that second. So what advice or what was your experiences with that balance?
So remember, I'm all about work-life harmony, right? So I work full-time right now. I'm in the doctoral program, getting my doctorate in social work at DSW. I'm also in the midst of planning a wedding. And life and everything else that's happening happens. So I found that having really great boundaries is important. And realizing that you can't do everything and you are going to miss out on some things. So figuring out, for me, I'm always like, well, what is a priority for me right now this week? I try to make it a point with my partner for us to do something, at least one thing every week together. So that way I'm still having those relationships or maintaining those connections, because you are a person outside of your schoolwork, all these different things, right? So it's important to think about, well, what are things that you can tap in? And I'm a little bit kind of obsessive with my calendar. Sometimes I schedule laundry if I have a really busy week. And that's when I know I need to like tone back a little bit because there's too much happening. So you have to find whatever balance works for you, making sure, like, I like going to the movies. So I try to make sure I go see a movie at least like twice a month, building in those times and being really intentional about how you're spending your time. And I don't do homework on weekends. But that does mean I have longer days, Monday through Friday, but I want my weekends to myself. So figuring out what works for you is important. And you can have a little bit of everything. So just figuring out when and how and what is more important at that time.
I agree. I was fortunate. I don't have any family in Baton Rouge, and didn't at that time, other than my children who were with me. So my focus was on school, work, children, not in that order, but those three. And I was fortunate, though, to have really good friends, who helped out in any and every way they could, coming to the house if I had to be away for something related to work or school. Friends who would cook dinners, for. And so anyway, I had a very good support system with my friends in Baton Rouge. So, but there were lots of things that my children, did not get to experience, especially during the 3 years of law school. But they knew going in, that our fun time would be limited. Vacations would be shorter and fewer in between. So, it all worked out. And so we've made up for it since then. But there's still only 24 hours in a day, whether you're going to work and go to school and get multiple degrees, or whether you're not. You still only have 24 hours in a day. I did learn how to survive well, on 5 to 6 hours sleep. When the kids would go to bed, I would take a nap, then I'd get up, do some homework, get back in bed and sleep a few hours before it was time to get up again. So you learn new skills. You learn how to economize. So even though you're not able to experience everything you would like to as often as you would like to, you will develop additional skills, additional life skills that will serve you well. And you'll be a good role model for your children. So they tell me.
Okay, so I'm a pseudo panelist. And let me tell you, Ayn and Sade, I agree. Like, there's a lot of stuff I had to miss out on because of being a dual degree that I actually grieved. And like, I was like, wow, I'm grieving this loss of having to say no. Like, for example, like not celebrating my sibling's birthday, because I had to study, or, not saying yes to this opportunity because I have an exam. And you do grieve the losses that you have in graduate school, but at the same time, it's like the knowledge you're learning and the payoff is so worth it, I would say. And just one thing to add is yeah, so you do grieve the loss, and I work with a leadership coach, and one thing she said to me, and she's a social worker herself, she said, and because I know a lot of social workers, we tend to be people pleasers and we say yes to every single thing. Yes, we're yes men and yes women and yes non-binaries. But she asked me today in our coaching session, she said, when you say no to something, what are you saying yes to? And that changed my perspective on saying no to people. Like sometimes you just have to say no because you're saying yes to other things. So just ask yourself every time you have to say no, what are you saying yes to in the grand scheme of things?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sade. Thank you, Dwayne.
Yeah, and I would just add, grad school's tough regardless, right? Yeah, we're all going through lots of transitions during that period and figuring out really a lot of times what career you want to go into, even in social work. Once you get into an MSW, there's like 1,000 options. You're like, uh-oh, which path do I decide to choose at the end? And I think that there are opportunities, what are your passions outside of social work, right? Like, is travel your thing? Is going to the movies your thing? There are some times that can get weaved into your track, right? There's lots of continuing education that's like travel continuing education, or going to conferences that are out of state that you might be able to get your program to pay for. So it's like, yes, I'm learning and doing this thing for my program, but I'm also getting a trip. I know Sade is like at a conference right now, out of state, right? There are ways to like build that into your work, whether that's during your graduate program or once you get into your career, that can help supplement maybe those things that are really important to you in your personal life. And I think that when we talk about harmony, I think that finding the positions and ways to really bring in what you care about and what builds you up. Because if I was on 5 hours of sleep, and I would not be very harmonious, I would tell you that. So I think like you got to find what works for you. And if you find yourself in the positions that don't have those things, that's really when burnout is going to be prevalent. And you need to be, if you can't mitigate burnout in a master's program or a dual degree program, it's probably going to follow you later on. And so building up those skills and capacities early in your career. Kellan, did you have any thoughts about what your experiences have been like, and anything you've had to either give up or that's been a surprise bonus?
Sure. My advice is don't put your life on hold to get a dual degree. I think if you're here and even considering a dual degree, it means that you're a particular kind of achiever, high achieving individual. I would also say don't let the dual degree or your pursuit of advanced education deter you from the learning that happens from living a full life either. That having a partner and finding a balance and starting family and staying connected to family, these are all really challenging learning opportunities too. And so don't hide out in a dual degree program and watch your 20s and 30s pass by. Because I'm going to be 40 in a couple of years, and I've been sort of pursuing education my whole life. And I'm like, boy, did I put my life on hold, or was I afraid to live my life? And advanced study was sort of like a way of kind of hiding out. And so I think some honesty for me in that area has been helpful too.
Yeah, thank you for that reflection and that honesty. And I especially think now, coming out of this pandemic, that we have been isolated for so long, and many of you probably did some of your schooling online or in virtual, or had to merge into a hybrid or virtual setting. We're missing that in-person connection again. And so I think there's, we're seeing that in the field too, is people just want to have the ability to not be so formal all the time and be able to share and be with each other and learn from each other. And I think that there's a whole host of options. Education looks so different even than it did 3-4 years ago. If we would have said social work programs would have all of these online options, I mean, that was really the fringe until COVID. Like there was not very many online programs, and now it's like many schools of social work in all of our states have options for folks. And so we've learned to be a little bit more flexible, and our work have as well, you know, both internships and the jobs we're in. We've got time for maybe a couple more questions. If folks have any, feel free to drop something into the chat, or if you want to raise your hand and I can call on folks. We'd love to hear any other thoughts you're thinking or questions you have for our panel here today.
So my name is Chancey. I hope I can speak instead of typing because
Yes,
it would
please
be
do.
okay. So I'm a BSW. I'm practicing as I live in the state of Nevada, and I'm practicing as a medical social worker through a hospice agency right now. And I'm able to do that with my licensing because my direct supervisor has a master's. And so I kind of get to fit in that role with her supervisory permissions. I'm looking at I'm looking at dual degrees, but I was really considering not even getting my MSW pretty much because the lean of MSW is very clinical. And I actually graduated in 2020, and I had a very first try at college, second try at college kind of a deal. And so it took me a while, but I'd always kind of known social work was my thing. I really got involved in it and loved it because of the policy, the environmental impacts we have, the organizing both at the community level and the federal level and everything about the macro side of social work was what I was interested in. I think because of COVID, I kind of got pushed into this medical social worker, very clinical job. I really struggle with finding avenues and ways to transition my job as a BSW leveled student into something more macro, so that I could even see if that's something that I'm pursuing or if this is just in my head a little bit as far as maybe I should just stick with clinical. But regardless, it seems like most of the master's level classes or programs, they're very, very clinical. So if anyone could speak on, how to access maybe some different opportunities for more macro level people, is the licensing really worth it to go down that road? And how would you give advice or maybe suggestions about how to move more into that macro space as a BSW student? Or as a BSW social worker.
Any initial thoughts from the panel? While folks are thinking, one of the things that comes to my mind is policy is a huge topic. So I think my first question kind of back would be, what area of policy are you interested in? And there is absolutely spaces for BSW at all of those tables as well. We had a social worker elected here in Michigan that has her BSW. Actually, two. We had one at the federal level, Hillary Skolton, who just got elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, has a BSW, and one of our state legislators also has a BSW. And so I think there's absolutely spaces that a bachelor's level degree can be influential at the political level. But then really, is it community organizing you're interested in? Is it local level politics? Is it legislative advocacy? Policy can encompass a lot of stuff. Grant writing even intersects in that work. And so I think that it's like getting involved in networks that are doing that work. You can really start to build up who you know, and then get exposure to where work might be and where you even could get potentially hired in those positions. An easy way for really everybody on here is wherever you live, your state chapter of NASW has a legislative committee. and a political action committee. So especially if you're interested in macro level stuff, those are two standard things that we have at the association level. So we help get social workers elected and social work friendly candidates. We also work on local and state policy level issues. And so we want and need social workers in our states to be helping us decide what we need to be working on, to testify on legislation, to write letters of support, to write op-eds. You know, it's a huge expansive area. And I think the more you can get connected to people in the space that you're primarily interested in, that's going to help figure out, A, is the BSW enough, or might I need some additional skills and tools in my toolbox? And then I think Sade and I are both macro licensed people. So I can talk from my experience as a macro licensed person in a state that has a macro license, that most macro level jobs are not going to require a social work license. That's the reality of the field we're in and the workforces we tend to be in. However, that does not mean that having a license doesn't make you more marketable, more valuable. And for me, I live in a state with title protection. I pay a lot of money, and I'm still paying a lot of money for this degree and these letters after my name. I absolutely want to call myself and represent myself as a social worker. And that means I have to be licensed in my state. And part of how I also view licensure is, I think continuing education really provides a lot of value into our profession, because it means we're continually learning and being exposed to best practices, new emerging trends. And I like that piece. And whether or not you're licensed or not, I think making sure that you are continually exposed to new information and new sets of people is really valuable. So, and that's not going to be every state. Not every state has a macro license. And so some macro folks really do feel pretty left out of the social work field. And I think as a larger field, and even at the educational level, we need to make sure that our macro folks are still a part of social work collectively.
Yeah, I echo all of what Dwayne said. I think part of why I got my license was hearing him talk about it a little bit, because a lot of times when people are working in macro spaces, they're like, well, I don't necessarily need it. What is the value? And I felt like, okay, I spent all this time getting this MSW and MPH. I want to be able to call myself a social worker. I'm living in the state of Michigan, which is one of the few states that has this opportunity to have this license. And honestly, I found going through the supervision process really helpful for me. Maybe it was the supervisor that I had, but I could talk about the different challenges that were happening in my job, think of ways that I could approach different problems, and I really enjoyed that process. And I also felt like the only way to add value to macro practice and add value to having the license is if more people get it and show why it matters. So I wanted to be a part of that change. Yeah. And I think there was something else I wanted to say to something that was said in terms of like having like the BSW and like trying to figure out, okay, when you're in these macro spaces, what you're doing at the clinical level can definitely be transferred. There's a document I shared early on in the chat around macro practices from Ideas LLC, which is Annie, and she's big on promoting macro practice, and she created this whole document about it. And like towards the end, it talks about how to transfer your micro skills to macro practice. So you may want to check that out too.
Yeah, and just one quick thing I would add to that, Sade and Dwayne, is I'm a limited licensed macro practitioner in the state of Michigan, and I think like finding your niche in macro work and like getting good supervisors, like Sade said, like we need more macro social workers, licensed social workers, because that supervision that you get from a supervisor that has that credential is impeccable, and you learn so much. And not to say other supervisors aren't as good, but like having that that license and those qualifications and the supervision has been helpful in my own professional journey as a limited licensed macro social worker as well.
Any last questions or burning things that folks want to ask our panel before we kind of wrap up for today?
There are a couple of questions in the chat.
Let's see if I can. I see one directed specifically at you. How did you decide on which DSW program? And I guess this could go for Kellan as well, somebody who is in a program. How did you decide the program and then the concentration associated with that? And I think you had two different journeys, so maybe that is a good question to kind of end on.
So I knew I didn't want to go the PhD route. I wanted to go the practice route. So practice doctorates are like a doctorate in public health, doctorate in social work, EDDs, all those different ones. They tend to be shorter. They also don't have the funding that the PhD comes with. So that's a factor to think in when you're choosing programs. But I literally did a lot of informational phone calls with different programs to kind of like see where was the best fit. Because I was like, okay, if I'm deciding this is kind of like a terminal degree, I don't intend to go back to school after this. I want to have the best experience. And I ended up only applying to one, which was University of Louisville. That's where I'm doing my program. I am in the first cohort of the program, so I took a little risk in terms of it being a new program. But what drew me to it is that it's more of a generalist program. So we actually have a leadership practicum and a teaching practicum built into the program. And then you do your capstone project for your third year. So we do classes for the first 2 years, and we do like 2 classes a semester, but 1 at a time. So it's really meant for working professionals. And I just felt sort of this warmth or like an embrace around me for this program versus others were very kind of standoffish. Because I am younger, that is a factor. They're like, oh, well, we typically have people who are like 20 plus years in the field. I'm not going back to school in 20 years, right? So for me, it was like a now or never thing. This was the perfect time point in my life to do it. So I wanted to find a program that sort of embraced the experiences that I brought to the table. And that's how I ended up at Louisville. I've been enjoying it so far. Doctoral learning, at least my experience, has been really guiding my own learning. In terms of like my class assignments apply to my job, so I can kind of take it in any direction that I want to. And that has been really helpful for me to like learn the stuff and apply it in real time, because I am an applied person. Concepts are great, but I need to do it. So that's been really helpful. And it's been really fun to like go through it. Not as stressful as I thought it would be once I got over the imposter syndrome hump. I'm like, I can do this. So that's how I chose mine.
And Kellan, any advice from your end about how you decided on a program?
My program decided for me. There are only 2 PhDs in anthropology and social work in the country. They're both in Michigan. And so, yeah, Michigan chose me. Happily.
Sometimes it's an easier decision than others. Well, I want to thank you all, Kellan and Sade and our pseudo panelist Brittany for joining us here today. This was a really fun conversation, and I know our panelists have put their information into the chat too if folks have follow-up questions. We have a couple of upcoming sessions that we'd love to make sure are on your calendar as well. Our student series happens every month, but it's open to anybody. Next week, we have a session on building your professional brand, which we know even as you think about advanced degrees or dual degrees, branding is a piece of it too. What is the marketing tools? That will be next Thursday at 6 o'clock. And then July 20th, we'll have a session on the changing landscape for student loan repayment, which we've mentioned a couple of times on this chat tonight. So we know lots of folks are thinking about that as that national landscape moves around over the last couple of years. But I want to thank you on behalf of NASW for joining us here today. We also have our leadership summit coming up next week for anybody who's interested in that. But it was a really fun conversation. And thank you again, Kellan and Sade, and we'll see you all hopefully next month.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.